Presented by RomulusIT.com, offering remote support for common computer problems. Landry.Audio, listen, like, and subscribe. Today we are speaking with Grapple Arts founder and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu expert Stephan Kesting, who can be found pretty much on any avenue of the web if you're looking for assistance building your BJJ game. He joins us from his home in British Columbia, Canada. So how are we today, Stephan?
I'm very well. Thank you so much for having me on. It's nice to be. It's amazing. Like, I mean, I was just telling my kids, and like they can log onto the internet and search what do snails eat, and they can have the answer 5 seconds. And have this conversation with you, literally on the other side of the planet, and we can talk about a sport that was, originally came from Japan, got mutated by some Scottish immigrants in Brazil, and is now being practiced all over the world. So it's pretty cool. It's we are the United Nations, or the United Colors of Benetton here on this podcast. So thrilled to be here.
It's very cool. It is, as we were saying before we turned on the mic and everything, while looking for, building your game, filling the holes for people that don't know, who might be stumbling across this, Stephan's an expert, and I don't use that term lightly, but knows Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu really well. And we'll go into that, and I guess talk a little bit about the origins, which is a form of ground fighting. And Stephan's been doing this for a number of years, what we'd call an OG in a lot of respects. And he now posts a lot of videos outside of his full-time job to help people develop their game, which is a sport in and of itself, and where a lot of people like myself were introduced to it came out of the origins of ultimate fighting, or NHB, or cage fighting, which was sort of a supplementary component of how you do that sport. So that's probably a good place to start off the conversation in terms of just offering your own explanation in your own words when people come up and ask you, and how you got into the game, because I think we're probably starting to talk about the early 90s around that point, wouldn't we?
We're actually talking a little bit earlier, because I remember, so in the late 80s, I was training a lot with Danny Nosanto, and
Right.
Danny Nosanto's
That's Bruce
affiliate
Lee, isn't
instructor. So Danny Nosanto, exactly, was one of the few people authorized by Bruce Lee to teach, and has also been responsible for introducing a ton of martial arts in North America. He helped popularize Thai boxing, brought shoot wrestling into North America. He's introduced things like Indonesian Silat, the Filipino martial arts. Just a renaissance man of martial arts. And he started talking about, I want to say in the late 80s, he started talking about how there was this thing called shoot wrestling and shoot boxing. And yeah, punching and kicking was important, but when you looked at it statistically, most of the matches ended by submission on the ground. And at the same time, kind of the whole Gracie in Action 1, Gracie in Action 2 thing started seeping into public consciousness, or at least into the consciousness of the people who were paying attention. And I remember getting bootleg tapes of Gracie in Action 1. I was a starving college student, and I managed to get my hands on it. I must have watched that thing 50 times. And from the first Gracie in Action, my training partners and I figured out that if it's a fight, two things. A fight's probably going to go to the ground. And if it goes to the ground, you want to be sitting on top of a guy in the schoolyard bully position, which later we found out was called the mount.
Yeah.
And then we started training. We would go, and I was training a lot of Kaju Kembo, which is a hard Kempo system. And fortunately, the instructor there was very open-minded. He had no problem with us after class and doing all the Kaju Kembo stuff, of staying behind and essentially trying to reverse engineer jiu-jitsu, right? We kind of knew that. I'd done some judo, so I knew what a jujigatame, a straight armbar was. I'd done some Japanese jiu-jitsu, so we kind of knew that if you twisted the wrist in certain ways, you could get a submission. I had long hair, like I had a big curly hair at that point, and we would just like be grabbing hair, gouging eyes, twisting fingers. Like I said, it was pretty low rent.
Yeah.
We were really discovering it from first principles, and of course we would have proceeded or developed a lot faster, but you know what, that certain intensity was still good. And anytime rolling around on the ground with people is good. It will have results. At the very least, it'll desensitize you to that panic that comes from close proximity, that claustrophobia. And that's really what a lot of people struggle with. And yeah, so that was the introduction. And then as the UFC came along, it further solidified the desire to increase the amount of ground training I was doing. At that point, there were no instructors around. So I went back to judo. I had done a lot of judo in my youth, and I found a judo club that did a whole lot of newaza, which means groundwork. And really, the origins of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu are in judo.
I only have to ask, because you mentioned the 80s with long hair. Were you a hair metal or heavy metal guy back then?
I looked like a hippie. I was the straightest hippie you'd ever seen. A beard, long curly hair, sometimes in a ponytail. I'd run around wearing like an army jacket, and I
something out of an Oliver Stone film, like Born on the 4th of July,
yeah,
or something like
but
that.
I really did look like I was, you know, a deadhead,
right.
Or I don't know, Jesus come out of the wilderness or something.
For people that don't, were you based in Van at this point in time? I mean, some of the guys that you ended up training with, you're all over the place across the North American continent.
Yeah, that was in Montreal. The French-speaking Canada, close towards the East Coast. It's a beautiful city. I love going back there, and I was there for 7 or 8 years. So I trained a lot with Philip Jelena and the Filipino martial arts and Kajikembo and various others, some Thai boxing, and it was a very formative period. And honestly, he was very knowledgeable, but he also gave you enough freedom to explore. And for example, I also became interested in capoeira, the Brazilian sort of dance fighting at the time. And you know, 9 out of 10 martial arts instructors can say, "What are you interested in that for? You know, you should just focus on your Shotokan, or you should just focus on your Taekwondo, or you should just focus on your you know, Bagua Kung Fu." He was like, "Yeah, sure. I know a guy who knows a guy who does a lot of capoeira. You should give him a call. Here's his number. And if you want to bring an instructor up, we can totally have a seminar." And I went and found an instructor, and we started our first capoeira group that was associated. Like, that's pretty rare to have a teacher who's that open-minded and that willing to, you know, to go back to Bruce Lee, absorb what is useful and study what is interesting and then reject what is useless. So it was, it really set the stage. Before that, I came out of a very strict Kung Fu background where you would barely ask any questions. You would certainly never say, "Hey, Sifu, do you mind if we just, you know, totally deviate from what you're teaching and explore this?" That's just not done in the traditional martial arts setting. So I was very fortunate, and it was very fortunate, and it was a breath of fresh air coming out of that stifled traditional atmosphere.
How did you manage to do that? For a lot of us, it seems hard enough to train in one art and become good at that. So it sounds like you're training like 6 different styles all at once.
Well, you become a bit of a jack of all trades, but you do try to master one. At that point, my focus was on Kajikembo. That's what I trained 3 or 4 times a week. But then, you know, you're 20 years old. You can train multiple times a day and not get worn down. I was in university. I was working pretty hard for a university student, but really, compared to real life, it's still a pretty privileged lifestyle. So, you know, I would go to the occasional seminar.
Kempo karate, like the hard style, pretty much punching to the chest and kicking.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. So we would start out a class with warm-ups, and then basically we'd take a big heavy medicine ball, which is basically a sandbag wrapped in packing tape, and one guy would lie down, you know, I would slam it into his gut as hard as he could 20 times, and you'd change, and then you'd, you know, one guy get in a horse stance, the other guy would side kick him and make him step back, and then side kick him again. And it was mostly targeted just to the abdomen, basically the belly button. And thus, you know, you'd think that there wouldn't be much carryover there, but there is. Just getting used to pain and discomfort and learning the right way to take a shot really helped. You know, it didn't make, you know, it didn't make me knockout proof, but it began to break the correlation between, "Oh my God, I got hit, it's the end of the world," to, "Oh yeah, I got hit. You know, that sucks." So there was a lot of physical conditioning and emphasis on impact training. Was it good for you in the long run? I don't know. It was good for me in the short run.
The Gracie in action videos, a few people have mentioned this, but again, it sort of predates my time because I kind of recognize 93 is when it hit North America and everything, and Shudo predating that in Japan. what do you remember about that period? Were they just promoting these through things like Black Belt Magazine? And what was the take up? Did people know that they exist, or was it still pretty underground even back then in the martial arts circle?
It was certainly pre-UFC, but even more importantly, it was pre-YouTube. So you had in the magazines, you'd have the Ninja Master claiming to be ultra deadly Ninja Master, and you'd have the Iron Palm guy saying that he couldn't pick up babies with his left hand because that was his iron palm hand, and if he picked up a baby, the chi from his killing hand would go into the baby and kill it. I remember that article. You'd have the Kyokushin guys talking about how they were the best, and you have these jiu-jitsu guys talking about how they were the best. And so it was hard to judge. I mean, we were doing sparring at that point, so it was the whole, and by sparring I mean pressure testing. And so I was beginning to figure out that this fancy hopping around pretending that you're a praying mantis or pretending that you're a monkey from the Kung Fu days didn't translate that well to getting punched in the face. Right? As soon as somebody gets punched in the face, they go from their fancy stance to something that kind of looks like a kickboxing stance. The universal evolution towards sort of something that's more or less kickboxing. But then there was always the Iron Palm guys going, well, this is way too deadly to spar. I can't show this to you. We can't spar it. I would kill you. Okay, that's interesting. And at the same time, there were also they were flogging the Gracie in action video, VHS tapes, like proof of the incredible, deadly efficacy of the Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. They were calling it Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, not Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at that point. And so it seemed interesting. And then a guy came to class who bought one of the tapes, and we watched it, and that really, seeing is believing to a certain extent. And in the era before YouTube, we would trade VHS tapes. I had a bunch of VHS tapes of capoeira. I would go and I'd find the National Geographic special on capoeira and have that on one tape. The amount of information and the speed with which information disseminates now is just astounding. I mean, if you and I are grappling and at a tournament, and you figure out how to do a flying berimbolo to north-south choke,
the break
right?
that start the Monday in the gym.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. The 24 hours will not go by before somebody else on the other side of the planet will be trying that, and if they hit it, then it's undeniable is a bit of a strong word, but it's a pretty strong indicator that you're onto something.
Well, we'll have lots of time to talk about how the martial art has adapted. It's just when I watch all of your videos, you always harken back to the old days, and that's why I'm really interested in exploring that and just understanding your journey of how you've come through it. Because a lot of us who practice BJJ, we are the true believers in a way that people from other martial arts aren't. So I want to take us to that point and then talk about, how you've sort of built a career in building a name there. So you watch these videos and at what point in time is it, because you end up moving over to Marco Soros's gym to train, I think, which is where you start. So can you take me through the steps of how this comes to fruition?
Sure. I had done enough. Okay, so 93 hit, and that was UFC 1. I was very, very interested in what was going on. And then a few UFCs later, Royce Gracie, Triangle, and I'd been upping my ground game in the training that I was doing. Like, it's clear that ground fighting is important. And then Royce Gracie fought Dan Severn. So this big, giant 260-pound wrestler who had just suplexed the crap out of everybody, and Royce Gracie triangle choked him. And in that moment, I was like, okay, I don't care how practical it is to train this or not train this. I have to find somebody who teaches this. And so my first teacher was actually a blue belt, Przemek Dobczynski. He was a Polish guy, and he was basically the only blue belt. I think it was one of like 2 or 3 guys in the entire province who taught jiu-jitsu. And blue belts were so scarce in the day that he would, on a weekly basis, take an hour-and-a-half ferry and basically an hour drive. So he'd take 2.5 hours to come to Vancouver to teach for a couple of days, sleep in the gym, and then turn around and go back to Victoria, which is where he lived. That's how rare blue belts were. And a whole bunch of us flocked there because he was the best teacher that was available to us. And now, to be fair, he was a very good blue belt. He was very analytical. He was a very skilled kickboxer as well. Had some kind of North American title in one organization. So not a low quality blue belt, a very high quality blue belt, but still, that was the most information that we had at the time. Also, we were doing something that we called the Uncle Willie's Grappling Association. There was a super low budget restaurant called Uncle Willie's. Basically, it was an all-you-can-eat buffet. All of us were starving students. And once a week, about 10 of us from different clubs, there were a whole bunch of Hapkido guys, there were some Judo guys, there were some Kajikembo guys. It was just a hodgepodge of people would meet at different martial arts clubs in the city, train together, and then go out for all-you-can-eat Uncle Willie's. And really, it was like, one of the guys would be like, I drove for 3 hours to Seattle and paid $200 for a private with a black belt there. And he showed me this one technique. And he'd come and maybe he would show you, maybe he wouldn't. Or they'd play coy, like, oh, I don't know if I want to show this to you. Because they had just paid $200 to learn, I don't know, an armbar entry or something.
Yeah.
And then there were the Panther production videotapes that were super low quality. But still, that was the only information that was out there. And one guy would get them and then maybe like dole them out one move at a time. it was, we were really grasping. We were really trying to figure this stuff out on our own, and progressed from there to training with Przemek, the blue belt. And then eventually also started training. I kept on training with him for years, but also training with Marcus Suarez, who was a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt from the Carlson Gracie lineage, who came up from Rio to British Columbia. So it was, compared to now, right? Now you basically go to any city in
it's
North
like
America.
a McDonald's. There's one within six
exactly.
blocks of the next one. Yeah.
Yeah. If you took a bow and arrow and knew which direction to fire, you could probably hit 5 of them. So it was a very, very different situation. And people were much more greedy or much more protective of their knowledge, right? You'd go to a class, you'd get armbarred a whole bunch of times. You'd ask the teacher, well, how do I not get armbarred? And his answer would be like, grow shorter arms. Because really what he was trying to do was to sign you up for a private class in which he would teach you for $100.
Yeah, of course.
Armbar defense, right? It was a very different world. I'll say the other big difference about back in the day, it was much more connected to the idea of fighting and MMA.
Yeah, very much.
And basically you thought you would have to like throw down to represent the art at the drop of a hat. So I think that's become somewhat decoupled. People talk about old school and new school and what's the origin of new school and I'll say that's one big divider, right? There was a generation of guys who came up really thinking about how to use this in MMA. If you were training in jiu-jitsu, probably there was a guy in your club who was going to fight MMA. Probably he did no boxing at all, and your training for MMA would be like rolling in t-shirts.
That era was still prevalent when I got into it in late 2003, 2004, at least in Calgary where I was. This idea that, we don't tap, even if the arm breaks, we don't tap in a fight, and you're a representative of your gym. You don't need to know any stand up. You have to just double leg and get it to the ground. I remember that era pretty well when it was still NHB.
I mean, as a basic strategy for somebody who's in a street fight and where engaging with somebody's a good idea, the basic idea of duck, close the distance, clinch or double leg takedown, pass their guard, get to the mount,
still
take
works,
the back, choke them out. It's still
perfect.
A pretty damn good strategy.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how under pressure, like the various psychological triggers for the person on the receiving end of that, it still works, right? Like if we're fighting and we're really upset, you're probably going to try and take my head off, probably with your right hand. I mean, if you watch enough street fight videos, that's probably 60% of the attacks, right? It's not the only thing. Sometimes you see a spinning back kick. Sometimes you see a headbutt. Sometimes you see a jump, spinning, reverse, spiking elbow or whatever. But most of the time it's the big right hand. So the basic idea of covering your face, level changing, stepping in and either clinching or shooting a double I mean, it
Oh,
might not work in MMA as well as it used to, because guys are now training specifically for that.
mm.
And the basic street strategy might not work if a guy's, extensively cross-trained in MMA. But against the average untrained fighter, man, jiu-jitsu still works really, really well, and it works much faster than, you can put it into action in real life much faster than many other pure martial arts.
I don't think people take into account, and I think even practitioners, even people that watch MMA who don't train enough, though, I don't think they watch enough street fights to see really how violent they are. Most of the fights that I end up seeing, first of all, there's a swarm, then it's windmilling of 1-2s while people have, they've planted their feet and they're going hell bent for leather.
Yeah.
Then someone ends up on the ground, and then we're into, one championship pride where it's just kicking the guy's head on the ground.
Yeah.
I really don't think people realize that. And that's why I'm still a fan of old school jujitsu, which is just close the distance, get on top and neutralize. And I think you were kind of alluding to this. It's, and again, it's probably because I grew up in a different generation of doing it, not as old as you, but around that area. It's kind of vexing to watch this new wave of spats jujitsu where they tap hands and go into seated guard immediately. It seems, it's still, even after watching this for many years, it just seems so counterintuitive to the way that I was introduced to the sport.
I'm not denying what you're saying, but I'll say two things. It's pretty easy if you say you're doing the most sportive style of jiu-jitsu known to man. Your entire game is based off the berimbolo and what's
Inverted guard, donkey guard, all this.
Sure, the donkey guard and the berimbolo. And that's all you train in the gym. Okay, your techniques aren't going to be dialed in for a street confrontation, but what will be dialed in is the ability to deal with pressure and the ability to deal with somebody who really does want to smash you because they hate that stupid donkey guard. They don't want to, and they're real, if they can, they really will choke you out. And they're really not going to let you do your flying donkey guard moves on them if they at all can. So that idea of applying techniques against resistance and dealing with somebody who really doesn't want to have you do something to them, that's still got a fair amount of carryover. I mean, if I had to choose who's going to win, and that is, I don't know, Jeff, no, this is a ridiculous example because he's so bloody good, but Jeff Glover, founder of the Donkey Guard. So let's say he's been doing jiu-jitsu for 20 years versus some guy who's only been practicing the most deadly killing moves. He's only been practicing eye gouges, biting the throat, and biting the groin. I'm going to choose Jeff Glover.
Of course, yes.
So I think training against resistance is the most important thing. It's the training method is more important than training techniques. Now, of course, if Jeff Glover just trained, stuff that is more dialed in for the street, he'd be even more effective. But I don't think Jeff Glover's going to have any problems on the street. And then secondly, say you're doing a sportive style, right? You like your De La Riva guard, and you like your ball and chain sweep where you're taking the sleeve and feeding it through the guy's leg and then grabbing the lapel and wrapping the lapel around the guy's head, or not a super self-defense oriented system. It's pretty easy to calibrate yourself a couple times a year. You or your teacher should make you put on bag gloves, go on the bottom, the guy on top, put in a mouth guard, and the guy on top tries to hit you. And very, very quickly, your body will calibrate to, okay, that didn't work. I'm not saying punch the guy's teeth down his throat, but, pop at 20 to 30% and just recalibrate your stuff for what works in the street. And then you can go back to berimbolo because you're doing the hard work already. You've done the hard work, which is bearing the pressure, getting your timing right, getting the conditioning to keep on going and going and going, learning to grip fight. I think it was on my podcast, I did an interview with Ryan Hall.
Yeah.
And at that point, people thought the end of jiu-jitsu had arrived because 50-50 guard was like, people hadn't figured out the counters to it yet. So 50-50 guard was just seen as purely a stalling position. Right? You would get a point or you get an advantage and you put the guy in 50-50 and hold him there for the end, for the whole entire match. You probably remember that kind of moral panic. But what's jiu-jitsu coming to? Right? We're done. We've reached the end of the evolution. 50-50 guard is the death of jiu-jitsu. And Ryan Hall pointed out quite correctly that from a self-defense perspective, if somebody's trying to punch you in the head, if you put them in 50-50 guard, they're not going to be able to punch you in the head no more.
Mm.
You've taken this sportive stalling position and turned it into a position that could allow you, I mean, if the guy's a knife or a gun, it's a different situation, of course. And I think that that's training for that is a whole nother level. But this very, very sportive position is a very powerful, sometimes to win in a street fight, you just need to stall.
It's
right.
Yeah,
If the
absolutely.
cops are coming, your wife's coming with a shovel, or maybe the other guy's buddies are coming with a shovel, but you don't have to kill the other guy to win. You just have to not die.
Well, I tell that to my guys in training, a lot of the newer guys. Oh, what do I do in half guard on the bottom or in mount? And I go, well, it's BJJ. There's no striking. Gather yourself for a second. Try to get on your side and stall. If we've got 6 rounds of 5 minutes and you're already tired by round 2, I'm like, you got to learn to ease up and know when to hit the gas and when to hit the brake when you're rolling.
For sure.
Mm-hmm.
For sure. And that, if you watch enough street fight videos, you'll see that basically if it's not over in 20 seconds, you've got 2 guys who look like they're drunk. If they weren't drunk already, they're drunk with fatigue now. It's just lactic acid is poisoning every organ system in their body because it's extremely exhausting, right? It's much more, you're a Canadian originally, I'm a Canadian. It's much more like hockey fighting, right? Like grab the jersey,
Awesome.
And it's not like, let us engage in fisticuffs and, oh, I'm slipping your jab and I'm setting you up for this. No, it's like you grab the guy and you hit the guy as many times as you possibly can. And probably, I don't know, you're throwing like 20 punches in 10 seconds and that's exhausting.
Yeah. And then someone comes and breaks it. It's very much like that. So what's, if we go back to that time, Soares comes in. I kind of did you notice a wave of, because the first wave of instructors into North America were the Brazilians. So did you notice sort of a point where they all just sort of showed up, started opening up their gyms, as you said, they sort of go for the private to build the club, and I guess out of that, how long did a wave of domestic black belts take?
Yeah, it was definitely a period where if you were Brazilian and you had a jiu-jitsu black belt and or any kind of world title, or any kind of Brazilian championship, you were pretty much guaranteed an income. Because you could go, and even if you weren't the best teacher, even if your pedagogy wasn't that good, even if you weren't even that nice a human being, you could still get a following just because you were a Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belt. I'm trying to think of when realistically, the first crop of North American domestic people opening schools was probably 5 years later, because at that point it was still possible to open a school as even a blue belt. Certainly as a purple belt, for sure a brown belt.
Maybe around 98 or a period around
in around then. I got my black belt New Year's Eve 1999.
Okay.
Is that right? No, that's not right. 2006. Sorry. New Year's Eve 2006. That's right. I remember the New Year's Eve part because my buddy and one of my main sparring partners had gotten promoted a couple of days before, and I was like, I knew I was going to get it. I was like very happy to get it on New Year's Eve. That way he couldn't say he'd got it a full year ahead of me.
Yeah,
he could only say he'd gotten a couple days ahead. I could already see where the angle was coming from and where the jibes were going to. So I was extremely relieved.
Were there guys, so even like when I started in Calgary, I trained under a guy named Alex Hockey, or people might know him as Alex Roque, who runs BJJ fight team there. And he was a blue belt under, I think his original instructor went by the nickname of Esfija. But either way, everyone knows sort of Gracies and Machados, who are really still Gracies, or I guess the cousins of them. Did Lucha Libre come in as well, or was it pretty much just you were either Machado or Gracie, or what do you sort of remember of them, I guess introducing themselves to North America?
Yeah. There wasn't as strong a Machado presence in Vancouver initially. I think I'm trying to think of when there's a guy called John who went over to them eventually. I remember I'm of that era when you could originally you could neck crank in competition. I remember being offered a
Can
3-month
openers?
tuition,
We're talking more of?
and can openers or the stocks from
Okay.
catch wrestling, or I remember Marcus offering a free month of tuition to anyone who could pull off a neck crank. The basically from knee mount, you pull the guy up, you weave your arm under his far armpit, and then you sit out to the stocks.
Okay.
And I remember trying my best to pull this off in competition, and I won with something else, but I didn't get that free month. There was no such thing as reaping of the legs. There were no real requirements about your gi. They could be any size, really. It really was the Wild West. I'm trying to think of other things that were legal then. So reaping was legal. There were no rules around, the types of takedowns you could use. Head inside, head outside, didn't matter.
You mentioned that because back when I had the old Atama gis, I'd be able to pull off the Ezekiels with the gi a lot easier.
Yes.
And now everything that, the sleeves around them they're like 2 inches thinner, where you can barely get your fingers in, and they're 1.5 inches down from the wrist, which makes it virtually impossible. And that clearly is where that onset of the sort of slicing version of that seems to have come from.
Yeah, I had a friend who was an Ezekiel specialist who ordered extra large sleeves just for that, and I went and took my gi and got it modified because I didn't want people grabbing my gi, and I actually got a version of the gi where basically it was like a sweater. There was no room at the wrist at all.
Yeah, right.
Like I said, it was the Wild West. The rules would change. It's not jiu-jitsu, but I remember going to an MMA competition. This was right around UFC 5 or 6. Do you remember the UFCs when every different UFC would have different rules? Like in this one,
they'd be moving it from state to state, trying to keep it legal and also trying to get people to appear. I remember that. So one would be like, you can wear wrestling boots. Next one, you can't, or something along those lines.
And there was one, I want to say UFC 5 or 6, where you weren't allowed to punch, and you'd be fined $25 if you punched. So basically, it was like, open hand hits.
Right.
But really, for a $25 fine, like most of the guys said, screw it, I'm just going to eat the $25 fine and knock the guy out with my fist. So I went to an MMA event in town in that era, and there was a friend of a friend was fighting, and I hadn't ever seen it live. It was the first live MMA event I ever went to, but I was there early, and I was there for the entire rules meeting, and the rules meeting went like this, quote, "Okay, guys, basically total UFC rules," end quote. So you had guys going in there thinking they weren't allowed to punch. You had guys basically trying to do pancration, like palm heel strikes. Yeah. You had other guys punching. You had other guys elbowing. You had other guys headbutting. You had one guy who knocked his opponent down right at the edge of the ring, stood on the guy's neck with one foot, grabbed the bottom rope, basically deadlifted himself, and then started stomping on the guy's temple with his other foot.
So WWF, literally.
Yeah, but trying to kill the guy.
Right. So
it just goes to there was no unified rule system. There was no agreement, and the rules in the UFC were changing so rapidly that okay, guys, basically total UFC rules doesn't mean anything at all.
So back in that period, then, because you're talking about this era and you're in Vancouver, did you ever run into or train with guys like Dave Beneteau then?
I never met Dave Beneteau, but I trained a lot with one of his training partners. A connection through SFU wrestling, but no, I never ran into Dave Beneteau. There were a bunch of there's a pretty good fight scene out of Vancouver. It's weird. I think there was just enough of a wrestling scene initially, and then enough of a old school boxing scene.
I think there was another old UFC guy named Jason something. I think who was originally an alternate who was from Vancouver who came in to
the infamous Jason Farron.
Is that who it was? Okay.
Yeah, he was a guy who had that match in the early UFCs where he fought Guy Metzger. They both had long hair, and they both agreed to not pull each other's hair. Yeah, so there were definitely a bunch of guys. There was a strong fight scene here, probably because there was a strong jiu-jitsu scene here, and probably because there was a strong wrestling scene. I mean, it's you're in Calgary. You're like Edmonton probably didn't have a strong MMA scene there because everyone was into hockey. So not as crazy, not as a hockey crazy town here as you guys were in Alberta.
They had a good year this year, though. I was watching the Canucks all the way through the playoffs, so I got my
Yeah,
little replica mask. But
sorry, I don't follow basketball.
fair enough. So how do you the guy that was very interesting to me is Eric Paulson. So as someone who came up from that era, he was he's sort of a demigod in the MMA community around that time, and was working with a lot of fighters. How did you cross paths with him, and what are your experiences with him?
Well, Eric was the kind of one generation prior to me, right? Like he was in the he trained in the original Gracie Garage.
Mm.
He competed back in the day when there were schools going, never open your closed guard ever.
Yes. Yeah.
Jiu-jitsu is the closed guard. Why would you ever open it? And then, some heretic would come along and go, no, but you actually can open it. Right? That was the first kind of clash of, if you want to say traditional Gracie versus Machado, I think that might have been the two players at the time. Obviously, both sides have evolved, and there's very good closed guard players on the Machado side now, and there's so many more players that initial rivalry or opposing worldviews, isn't relevant anymore.
Mm.
But yeah, so he was the generation before. He also trained in shoot wrestling with Yuri Nakamura, which was, so the connection there was fostered through Daniel Inosanto. He was one of Daniel Inosanto's
Right.
students
Okay.
who started doing shoot wrestling and had a background in Taekwondo, and got into jiu-jitsu early. And it was through the Inosanto connection that I hooked up with him. So I've known him a long time, and it's really cool to run. Some people are just encyclopedic, right? They're like vacuum cleaners.
Mm.
They vacuum it all in, and then they somehow can just sort it out into 18 different variations of an armbar. But here are the two that work the best, right? It's really cool to see people of that kind of encyclopedic knowledge and are happy to show it to you. And then even more rare is kind of prioritizing it for you, going, yeah, you can do this, 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 you can do this. But when push comes to shove, most people do this or that. Like, that's really important knowledge. So you're familiar with all of it, but then you also know what the high percentage stuff is. Because you take a look at some of the older grappling books, there's a lot of low percentage stuff you can do that'll work once or twice, right? The idea of high percentage, we know the arm bar is high percentage. If you and I are grappling and I see that you're going for an arm bar on me, there's a pretty damn, and I recognize it, there's a pretty damn good chance you're still going to finish that arm bar. If I'm going for a heel hook on you, it's not a mystery move. You've seen it before. But depending on where our relative levels of skill are and our depth of understanding that position, there's a pretty good chance I'm going to finish that heel hook. Now, if we're going for, like, I don't know, an obscure Aikido wrist lock that I'm trying to catch as we're both, starting on the knees, bump and shake, or, slap and bump, and then I go for a wrist lock. If I catch it once on you, we could spar for another 10 years and you're never, ever, ever going to let me catch that again. So which one is high percentage? Well, clearly the armbar. I mean, not to say the wrist lock isn't fun, because if I did catch that, I would lord it over you till the day we died. But it shouldn't be your bread and butter. It should be like one of those things you pull out of the hat occasionally as a party trick. And people are, if you see it at the black belt level in elite competition, right, at the nationals or the Pan Ams or the World Championships, one of two things. Either that guy is a total genetic freak and can do things that nobody else can, or he's doing a reliable technique that he's hit thousands of times in sparring and now hitting it against somebody else who's also very good. And that's a pretty good measure of what a high percentage technique is.
One of the as I mentioned to you, so my instructor who I train under is Anthony Parosh. And one time when we had him come by the gym to do some seminar work, now that I don't live in the city, we were doing some no-gi work, and he came up with a statistic, and I don't know where he pulled it from, but he was saying that ultimately in the game, it's like oftentimes the same mistakes end up being made, even if you're a beginner to an expert. And the way that he pointed this out, he said, pulled out a statistic somewhere and said in ADCC matches, when someone moves to turtle or goes to their back, maybe out of side control, out of a desperation when they can't bridge out. He goes, that move still ends up being something like, 40 to 60% of the finishing submissions that you see where they take the back and end up getting the rear naked choke. And it was just a fascinating statistic that he presented, that it still ends the same way oftentimes from when you're, blue, purple, or brown, that once you hit sort of a plateau or level of exhaustion, you end up making the same sort of lazy escapes that cause your demise in a roll. I found it fascinating.
Yeah, and that kind of, sometimes that stuff is driven by the rule set, right?
Yeah, of course.
If let's just say that if judo had, I love judo, and I think judo groundwork is great. I think it's got a couple gigantic flaws. Number one, they don't allow enough different kinds of submissions. Number two, going to turtle or going belly down is considered an escape. Whereas I think if we're in a judo context and I put my hooks in, that should be considered a pin. That should be considered a pin the same way that kezugatame is considered a pin, the same way that side control, or what they call yoko shiogatame, or the mount, or tate shiogatame, is considered a pin. And if I pin you in judo for 20 seconds, I win. So I think the rule system drives a behavior that's not very combative, right? In judo, a very common escape is to roll to your belly, grab your lapels, burr your neck, and then try to hang on for the next 5 to 10 seconds.
Yeah.
And you'll get stood up. It's totally valid within that sport, and people have won world championships by using that strategy, but it's going to develop bad habits combatively. And so there's always, how do you structure the rules to make it more or less combative? And that takes us back to, this whole, two guys pulling seated guard right at the beginning of their match, because it's probably the best thing to do within the rule set, but it's not necessarily the best thing to do combatively.
Well, I did only a little bit of judo. I trained it for a few months just to supplement when I was doing BJJ, and it really explains why there seemed to be a lot of rolling crucifix arm bars from that position. I suppose it sort of alludes to what you're saying about getting into that position. So introduction of BJJ. Do you? And I find this happening again. So I guess we'll talk about a little bit more about MMA and what that means to martial arts. With the onset of the UFC, I thought it had achieved its goal of really saying, let's look at what is real and what works. These days, it seems that, what happened 25 years ago doesn't matter at all. You've still got all these traditional martial arts schools going. And then in BJJ, we've now splintered off into a number of different versions where you've got, MMA style jiu-jitsu, self-defense style jiu-jitsu, gi jiu-jitsu, and no gi jiu-jitsu, where it just seems to have fragmented the environment anymore. Talk about that in a second, but when this stuff kicked off and, going back 30 years, the guys who were doing traditional martial arts, did you find that all of them flocked into BJJ, or ultimately did some say, wait, no, not for me. I'm going to stick to, as you said, praying mantis and all this sort of thing?
I'll say as jiu-jitsu became more popular, more and more karate guys discovered that move 12 of their kata was actually a wrist lock.
Right.
And thus they could advertise karate and grappling on their placards. But really, I'm quoting Dan Santo here. A martial art is 3 major components. It's the techniques, it's the training methods, and it's the training equipment, right? The techniques are a wrist lock, an arm bar, a shoulder throw, an over-under guard pass, or whatever. That's the technique. The training method is training it against resistance. So just because move 12 of some karate kata could symbolize a wrist lock, that's great, that's the technique, but what's the training method? How are you actually training that against resistance? And if you're not training that against resistance, the odds of it working in real life are 100 times lower. It's not impossible. You occasionally see somebody pull something off that they've never trained against resistance, but statistically, you're playing a numbers game. The odds of it being successful have just plummeted. And then, the training equipment is important too. If we trained all the same techniques of jiu-jitsu, but we did it only on pavement, only on hardwood floors, the sport would look different. I know, because I have trained it on pavement and I have trained it on hardwood floors, and it was dumb, right? It it's something that you can do if you really, really have to, but if you did it on a regular basis, you would be injured and crippled in short order and end up degenerating your joints even faster than the sport does.
Mm.
So I'm very happy to train on mats. The softer, the better at my age. And then if I ever have to use it in the street, you know what? I'll just suffer for a little bit, but you'd be so amped in adrenaline that you're not
Yeah,
going to
yeah, of
feel it.
course.
But it'd be a dumb way to train.
You're one of the few guys that will have the chance to ask about that, because Dan in the center comes from Bruce Lee. Tao of Jeet Kune Do in that book really was open to all styles. So I guess wanted to confirm that when you were training with Dan Inosanto, that those sort of ideals carried over, didn't they? That it was really sort of whatever we can make work for us.
Yeah, and the man is really open-minded. I mean, it would not be unusual in that era for when he went back. He'd be teaching his own classes at night, but he'd be taking 3 or 4 other people's classes during the day. Right? He'd be going from the Machado school to train, and then from the Machado school to do a private with Hickson, and then to go train in some new Filipino stick fighting system that he'd never heard of, and then go teach his classes at night. So it really was walking the walk. It wasn't just like, oh, we should be open to training all styles, but guess what? You can learn all styles from me. No, he really was walking the walk and being demonstrably open-minded. Some people are exposed to his stuff more in the seminar context, and it's quite, not quite, reasonably different from the experience at the academy, because at the academy they're actually sparring a lot of this stuff. Whereas if you're teaching a seminar to 80 people and you now introduce sparring, things can go haywire pretty quick, right? You just don't have the bandwidth or the span of command, the span of control to make sure that 40 pairs of sparring people aren't going to knock each other's teeth out.
As I said, I ended up getting into MMA. I remember the UFC dropped off for a few years, and then Pride. And I always try to go back and see the timeline of it. So it was Shudo really that came out of Japan, sort of from Ultimate Japan. And then after Shudo, I think the UFC hit. Then there was a couple of events of Coliseum which were Hickson's first events before the lead up to the first version of Pride under KRS. Do I have that timeline correct?
I'm not that familiar with the Japanese timeline of how they got. I mean, I know that the shoot wrestling thing grew out of something called shoot boxing, and then eventually it morphed into Pride, and then Pride essentially was shut down when I think the Japanese cable network said, no, this whole thing is just rotten with the Yakuza.
Yeah.
We're not going to handle it no more. And basically overnight, this giant organization disappeared. It's really interesting to see all the martial artists, Japanese, Brazilian, talking loyalty, 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 loyalty. Yet when you take a look at what's going on in Japan and Brazil, everybody's splitting from everybody and forming their own rival organizations, right? The shoot boxing split from the shoot wrestling, and then there were rival organizations there, and then a bunch of guys went over to Pride. And I mean, don't even get me started on Brazilian politics about who's splitting with who and joining leagues with this other team, and they're all traitors. And I mean, why can't we just why can't we all just get along? To quote Rodney King.
What do you think about that in terms of loyalty, which is a very traditional martial arts thing, but we're completely on the other side of the scale where, if you read the forums, we've got guys that go, I don't really care. I work in a corporate environment. I pay $150, $200 a month to train. Don't talk to me about loyalty. I'm just here to get a sweat on. I don't want to roll too hard. What do you think about how that's changed and sort of where that, I guess, leaves us with the, 2000 years of values of like respect and honor to your sensei and all these sorts of ideas that over the last 10 years have just kind of been ditched in favor of capitalism.
I think a lot of shitty stuff has been done in the name of respect and honor of the sensei, just how like a lot of shitty stuff has been done in the name of yoga gurus spreading their art. And guess what, the hot yoga guy, oh my God, I've forgotten his name.
Just where they turn into like a free love cult and all that.
Yeah, no, no, not a free love cult, just a free love for the main instructor.
Yes.
I want you and you and you to be here stroking my hair as I'm teaching the class. So I think here's what I think about loyalty. I'll be loyal to my instructors by giving credit where credit's due. Right? I've in this conversation, I've given credit to I think 4 people, and I could go on. I'm not currently training with Philip Jelena because he's in Montreal and I'm here. I'm not disloyal because I'm not training with him. I'm not disloyal because I'm not training the main martial arts that he taught me.
Yeah.
I'm loyal because I'm saying, I'm giving credit where credit is due, and passing that, sort of paying that forward or acknowledging that. I'm not training that much Filipino martial arts these days, which is of course what Daniel Santo is known for. But I'm paying homage to the parts that I really take away and the parts that I really use. Also at the technique level, if you show me, if I learn a really cool leg lock setup by watching Josh Barnett, okay. It's okay for me to teach that. I just have to say, I got this by watching Josh Barnett. It's not like I am the font of all wisdom that there ever is and that there ever has been.
You do a really good
there ever
job of
will
that,
be.
though. Your videos always introduce or say, "Hey, I saw this one," so you always give credit where it's due. I find.
I think that's kind of an important take on the loyalty thing. I mean, ultimately, a martial arts instructor is somebody who, a jiu-jitsu instructor is somebody who can show you how to break somebody's arm more efficiently and choke somebody unconscious. They're not an expert. You shouldn't go to them necessarily for medical advice. Maybe they have a little bit more medical knowledge than the average person.
Let's take the conversation there, because we were talking about it, about the bro science that infects jiu-jitsu and the cult of conspiracy theory, where I'm a relatively center right leaning person, but I can see a lot of this stuff for what it is. I mean, I guess we may not be as involved in other communities of any other type, but this sort of thing is perpetually involved in our sport. What do you think about it is that sort of attracts these ideas or personalities?
I wish I knew. I used to think that things like jiu-jitsu would on average be less prone to magical thinking and conspiracy thinking, just because I'm not going to, if you tell me this is the best armbar setup that there's ever been, I'm not just going to take your word for it. I'm going to go test it. And so that emphasis on empirical testing, which really the whole art is built around, I thought that this would somehow translate to a more skeptical approach to, flat earth stuff, or, lizard people controlling the earth, or COVID was created in a Chinese lab to assassinate President Trump so that, by the Jews, right? Or whatever the crazy conspiracy is. I used to think that jiu-jitsu would be more immune to that. Sadly, I think that hypothesis was incorrect. I think there's so much bro science and so much conspiracy thinking. I think those are also different things. I think bro science is different from conspiracy thinking. Bro science is kind of taking complex ideas and something that kind of worked for one guy medically, or to get jacked. I started taking this Megaplex 5000, and dude, if you take that and you drink a gallon of milk a day, you're going to make it to 280 pounds with abs. That's kind of more what I look at as bro science. But it's not a very deep understanding of the science. It's kind of invoking science without a deep understanding of the scientific underpinnings of that idea. Or bro stats, right? Bro statistics. Taking a look at, serological test data without understanding how that serological test data was gathered, right? So it's kind of a surface or superficial appreciation of the science. The conspiracy stuff, man, it's really cutting close to home. I have one theory, and that is that conspiracy thinking is more prone in the various industries that are more heavily affected by COVID precautions, right? So yoga studios, obviously heavily affected by COVID, already prone to woo-woo thinking. It's not that surprising that they would go over to say, like, man, it's just about your connecting your heart chakra to your pineal gland and having a healthy immune system. It's self-serving though, right? Because if that's true, then you don't need to shut a yoga studio down if COVID gets out of control in an area. Similarly, I find musicians whose livelihood is legitimately heavily affected,
Of course.
tend to be more prone towards calling this a conspiracy or being COVID minimizers or COVID deniers. And same thing for jiu-jitsu. I mean, it's undeniable that like this is affected, especially in parts that are heavily hit and areas that have taken heavy precautions, have disproportionately affected jiu-jitsu studios compared to, say, I don't know, outdoor boot camp, right? Or a running clinic, or the kiteboarding community, or the canoeing community, or the snorkeling community, right? Those,
Yes.
so the snorkelers have not been as affected by this as much as the jiu-jitsu guys. So it's not surprising that they as a community, and especially the teachers, would gravitate more towards the interpretations that would allow business to continue as normal.
That's sort of current events.
That's a theory. I don't have data on that.
That extends into moon landings and flat Earth and stuff. But I guess we're not a conspiracy talk show by any means. So
yeah, I mean that's pretty easy to explain. I think some of the big names, we'll call him Eddie. I'll name it. Eddie Bravo has been pumping conspiracy theories for at least a decade, and Joe Rogan has enabled it. Right? He may not believe. I don't know. I forget. I can't keep track. He doesn't think the Earth is flat. He does think space exists. I think he thinks the moon landing was faked, but he's also had guys like Alex Jones on the show and given them a platform, right? Who the last time that, what was it, episode 9/11 on the Rogan podcast, like Alex Jones was ranting about interdimensional aliens coming and smuggling children to the moon as part of the whole Pizzagate conspiracy.
I've never been offended really by any of that stuff. The only stuff that really sticks out to me when I hear about that is when they get around to the idea of calling something atrocious like a school shooting a conspiracy theory. I think that takes it to a plateau that I'm really not comfortable with when you're denying other people's tragedy and mourning. I think that's something entirely different than saying that the moon doesn't exist or something along those lines. Yeah,
I think there are definitely some theories have greater and lesser implications for harm. I would argue that, you can cure cancer by drinking your own urine, and that's not so much in the jiu-jitsu community, although, the Machida.
It's more of a Machida thing.
It's more of a Machida thing, but it's also a yoga thing.
Okay.
Right? We're actually beginning to have the real potential for harm. And if you want to take it, the people who are really pushing the, COVID was created in a lab in China, in the Wuhan and the level 4 biosecurity lab there, and released in order to assassinate President Trump, which is a conspiracy theory that's out there. Well, now we're talking about potentially ending life on Earth. Right? Are you really trying to convince the United States to go and saying that this is an act of war from China? Well, okay, there's the moon landing is fake. All right, that doesn't really affect too many people. Not any of us are going to be taking a trip to the moon anytime soon. Then there's drink urine to cure your own cancer, which could hurt some people. And now we're talking about a theory where, in theory, you're promoting war between two gigantic nuclear armed superpowers.
Yeah.
Right. If enough people, Siri, as I'm talking about conspiracy theories, my phone starts, Siri activates
listening
on my phone,
in,
to let the NSA know.
Yeah.
Right. So that is, I look at that and I'm like, oh my God, the geopolitical implications here of, do we really want to ramp up tensions between the United States and China right now? And when people who are running for Congress, think it was a wannabe congresswoman who I saw tweet that. Like, that gets to be really serious. So it's, maybe the moon landing is a gateway drug and just gets to kind of.
Look, there's truth and merit in it, though, and I'm not talking about the conspiracies themselves, though, but I certainly recognize the way that there's more and more manipulation through mainstream media, and so I can understand how people are just deciding to tune out completely. What they end up getting out of that after the fact, I think, is entirely different. But I sympathize with the fact that every time I turn on the news, and I'm halfway around the world, I'm in Australia. Trump is on the television 24 hours a day, and there's nothing but everything that he's possibly done bad. They may look at this idiot eating with a knife and fork today, and I'm just like, this is not news. So I can understand how people are, jumping off that. But as I said, where they end up from that, I think, is really the problem these days.
Yeah. I mean, everyone's talking about The Social Dilemma, right? That new Netflix documentary, where basically it's pointed out that Facebook makes money. Facebook doesn't make money if you log on to Facebook and it's like, hey, everything's groovy today. And Facebook doesn't make money even if they're like, President Trump is a demon from hell. If every post on Facebook says President Trump is a demon from hell, they're not making money. Where they're making money is by having half the people say Trump is a demon from hell, and that's the only thing that the people on the left see, and the other half see Trump is a light
Emperor
worker.
Trump.
Emperor, yeah. And by pandering to both sides and only showing them their half of the debate, that's undeniable. To some extent, the media is like that, but I mean, I don't really consume that much mainstream media. I do subscribe to the New York Times, right? So, okay, now that's biased left-wing BS. Well, most of the time, actually with regards to COVID, because I've got a background in biology, right? So I'm often go to the original scientific literature on this stuff. When the New York Times has made a statement about COVID, and you go track it back through, okay, this journal said this and that journal said that, and like, okay, that's actually a chain of causality here. Whereas on other mainstream media, and I include Fox, like, you sometimes track that back and you're at the exact opposite of where you are. Now, New York Times is obviously biased politically, but in terms of the scientific, and I'm not really able to evaluate that. I'm not a political scientist. I can't and
Well, it's getting harder for people to do that, but people turn to the news to get educated on a subject matter. And when you're hearing three different points of view saying three different things, I understand how it's sort of gotten to this point.
It's interesting when you go to a scientific conference, or when you've never heard a less unified point of view, right? Like, so I deliver a presentation on, I don't know, the rate at which beavers chew trees.
This is my favorite topic. I'm so glad that we approached it today.
And at the end of that presentation, half the audience is going to try and tear me apart and go, well, did you account for this? Did you account for that? Or you put 4 scientists in a room and you get 5 different opinions. The idea that there's this magic red phone that whoever they is, can call and go, okay, scientists all over the world, we need you to agree that, I don't know, on whatever they talk. Here are the 4 talking points you must have. It's ridiculous. Like, if you actually spend any time in the scientific community, I mean, if I have a new theory of dark matter in the universe,
yes,
and I think it's, I don't know, floating popcorn kernels, and I put this out there, I'm going to get attacked, of course. But if I can prove that it's actually floating popcorn kernels, my career is set. I get the Nobel Peace Prize. I get tenure. I'm famous for life. I've got grad students.
It's also very hard. Like, when you read, someone will come out with a new nonfiction book on a theory of something that happened in Pompeii. Oh, here's my new evidence. And it's so hard to say an event that happened thousands of years ago that some guy's now written or, read 15 textbooks and come up with a new theory on it. And that theory now stands. I find that another thing. I think, it's probably more of a human issue about being able to compartmentalize and understand, but I think a lot of it, people need to be able to allow it.
Something about being able to hold a thought without accepting it, or hold a belief without accepting it. And I think that's how a lot of science works. And honestly, when you see the original, like when you read the original scientific papers, they're couched, and you go to a conference or something, it's couched in so many, okay, if our measurements of this beaver chewing are accurate, and if our analysis of this is accurate, and if this trend is the same in neighboring watersheds, then we could expect X, Y, Z. So the guy's qualified it like 3 or 4 times, right? And then the media hears just the final result, the most sensational result, and broadcasts that, because this idea of sort of nuance or hedging, like, hey, if these, I don't know, the gravitational lensing data that we're getting from Alpha Centauri is accurate, and if these, I don't know, gravity wave measurements from LIGO are accurate, and if our math is all right, then this proves that the dark matter is popcorn kernels, right?
Well, this is why I think there is a problem with sciences these days too, and that this again is more, you know, treading into that conservative argument. You start getting into concepts of climate change, but it's the same thing that, you know, in order to continue their research, they're dependent upon funding. So there's already a conflict of interest, I think, a lot of the times with this, and it begins, as I said, you know, if you're already working 8 to 10 hours a day, you expect just to be able to gather some information. I think it becomes a hard ask of people to then say, here's 10 pieces of news, now go out there and disseminate it again for yourself before you come up with an opinion, while they're working, you know, 40 to 60 hours a week.
For sure. It doesn't stop people, though.
Doesn't.
And
Doesn't.
I mean, you see some of the stuff that's being shared, and like the headline is in direct conflict with the article. So, you know, they didn't read the article.
Well, I was even going to say you've made the assumption that beavers exist in your paper, which is
exactly.
so, you know. Well, look, let's kind of wrap it up and get back to martial arts here. So do you still do stand-up? This is one of the things that I notice with a lot of people as they transition to BJJ. That becomes their one and all, because it is pretty all-encompassing. And I find a lot of people and other guys online, like Jiu-Jitsu and stuff, who post, that they kind of end up giving that up completely to become rollers.
A little bit. The answer is a little bit. I can't do as much as I would like. In 2015, I had a life-saving kidney transplant. So I have one functioning kidney. It was just a genetic condition called polycystic kidney disease, where basically the kidneys went from like half a pound each to about 5 pounds each, and grew a whole bunch of cysts. So maybe that was exacerbated by years of judo, just that getting pounded, and years of abdominal impact in sparring, and medicine ball conditioning and stuff like that, just in me. Most people probably okay with it.
Right.
So given that I have one kidney, I've got to take care of it now. So that unfortunately rules out a lot of the impact training. So that makes it harder to do meaningful kickboxing, meaningful stick fighting. And just the amount of power involved in takedowns is considerable. That's a lot of sort of hydrostatic impact if you get thrown to the ground and do a big impact. And so I on the ground, I'm grappling and you know, pressure testing. On the standing, I've done a lot of that in the past, and I'm trying to do just enough of it to keep it alive. But also, you know, I would really rather not go through the process of a second kidney transplant. So the answer is no. But if I had my druthers, I would be doing at least some of that. I think as a martial artist, it's important to be well-rounded. As a martial artist, yeah, you can specialize. You can be a ground specialist. But like I said earlier, a couple times a year, you should put on the bag gloves and let somebody punch you from the top, essentially. If you're on the bottom, anybody can win a fight from the top. So go on the bottom, try and let them punch you. And you should do basic takedowns, right? You should have a single leg, you should have a double leg, you should have an ankle pick, you should have an arm drag to the back, and a couple ways to take the guy down from there. And that's just off the top of my head. You should know how to, you know, the basics of boxing. You don't have to be a Lomachenko, but you should be able to throw a jab, you should be able to throw a cross, you should be able to throw a hook, and you should be able to close the distance.
You just need to be a Ricardo Arona.
Sorry?
A Ricardo Arona, just a whopping 1-2 to close the distance.
Yeah. Some's better than none. You should also have a basic understanding of weapons. Again, you don't have to be some kind of, Filipino martial artist with a stick whipping all around, but you should know how to throw a powerful angle one, a powerful angle two, how to crash, how to grapple with that stick. And I would even make an argument that if you're a martial artist, you should know the basics of firearms. I don't think you need to go down the absolute like gun nut route unless that's really what turns your crank. I think most people go down the gun nut route have the opposite problem, which is that they have nothing else other than that gun, often, including fitness. Right? So they're
I've always said the best martial art is to learn how to sprint.
Yes. And I'll say that the odds of getting killed by an attacker in Australia and Canada and most parts of the United States are pretty low. Therefore, you're most likely to be killed by heart attack, stroke, and cancer. So I think sprinting is a totally valid form of self-defense, but even long, slow sessions on the elliptical or on the rowing machine are also a form of self-defense because it's going to cut down greatly on your chances of dying a heart attack and stroke. Right? It might delay it by another 10, 15 years. And has a great benefit on your martial arts.
I want to start wrapping up because I'm sure you're probably getting tired of this chat and want to do other things today. But just to sort of get to where we are, I mean, since it started out, there's now a lot of, for guys that are actively practicing, it's less jiu-jitsu and it's more grappling. And what I mean by that is that you should be integrating, freestyle, Greco-Roman wrestling, elements of judo. There's other things that have started to pop out of the woods, like catch wrestling that are now popping in. We're getting this debate. Do you consider it Brazilian jiu-jitsu these days, or how do you sort of see what we're doing now as an art?
Well, I mean, there's so much evolution all over the world that I still call it BJJ, but honestly, when you take a look at a lot of the no-gi tournaments, it's pretty distinct looking. So I think it's too soon to say. If I look at what I've written recently, I've often used BJJ and jiu-jitsu. So that's two different terms, right? One is leaving out the Brazilian part, and the other is BJJ just because by habit. So I don't know. I think it'll be really interesting to see where the sport goes. It's kind of a Cambrian explosion of different
if the dinosaurs exist, if the Big Bang exists.
Oh, good Lord. Kill me now. The fossils were put on Earth to test your faith.
Correct.
I'm going to get majorly sidetracked here. That's
talking about where the sport is. Okay.
I think that was my first encounter with conspiracy. Really was, or the conspiracy type thinking was arguing with literalist creationists.
Okay.
But yeah, I think it's too soon to say. I think we're seeing new formats being invented all the time. It's a rapid evolution. There is a split happening, right? It used to be that the guys who would win ADCC were all the jiu-jitsu guys who trained with a gi. That was definitely the pattern for 10, 15 years. And I think that pattern is beginning to fragment, and that we're beginning to see specialists, right? That no-gi specialists will tend to do better in no-gi events. That was definitely not the case. And I think the reason for that was that in 2002 and in 2005 and in 2010, if you wanted to train with the best grapplers, you went and trained with the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guys who spent most of the time in the gi. They were just objectively better because they had that much more corporate experience and time on the mats. And you had the guys who've been black belts for 10 years and were still competing. They're going to be deadly with or without the gi.
Yeah. So
you'd go and train with the gi just because that's where the highest level of training partners were. I don't think that's true anymore. I think there are a lot of, I'm not a fan of Eddie Bravo's flat earth stuff, but it's undeniable that the 10th Planet guys are pumping out a ton of no-gi guys who are pretty bloody good.
Yeah.
Right? And that's the advantage of specialization. And it's undeniable that the competitors who spend almost all their time training no-gi are doing very, very well in the no-gi tournaments. So I'm wondering if it'll split. It might well split. And then it might end up in a situation where, kind of like what happened in the early 2000s, when the karate guys realized they couldn't compete. They couldn't make the argument that we are the most effective system for fighting, because the UFC had come along and proved that. And they kind of just took their ball and went home. Like, they kind of just split off and like, okay, we're doing karate and we're going to do it for these reasons. We're going to do it here because it's great tradition. It's great fitness.
So sorry, what do you see that schism as? What are the branches that you're alluding to here?
Well, gi and no-gi to start with.
Okay. I think that's already happened. There's
still some cross, like a lot of the Brazilians are still competing in both, and we'll really have to see how they do in the big tournaments. But
did you learn, so our Parosh, my instructor, came straight from he's a black belt of Carlos Machado in Dallas, so there's that sort of lineage, and we still work with a syllabus. That's also another area where guys say, oh, we'll show you stuff, it's up to you to learn your stuff, and then you advance based on how you roll. Do you think a syllabus is important anymore, or sort of having a playbook to work from?
Man, that's a really touchy question. I think in an ideal world, I work with a student one-on-one. Okay. Fundamentally, you need, there's somewhere between 6 and 8 most common positions in jiu-jitsu, right? Everybody agrees there's a thing called the mount. Everybody agrees there's a thing called closed guard. Everybody agrees there's a thing called side mount. Everybody agrees there's a thing called turtle, the back. And those are the common positions. And for each position, you need ways to get out of it if you're on the bottom. You need ways to attack if you're on the top. And you need ways to change the position. For example, if you've got somebody in your guard, you need a way to change a position, which means to sweep them. So I don't really care how the person knows, how the person controls the back, how the person submits from side control, how the person passes the guard, how the person does guard retention. But those are fundamental boxes that need to be checked off. A friend of mine, Robert Naki, with whom I've done a whole bunch of instructionals with, has an interesting system for giving stripes out, right? There are 4 stripes on a belt. One stripe is for guard retention. The other stripe is for guard attacks, or guard passing. Another stripe is for controlling the top position. Another stripe is escaping the bottom position, or controlling the back.
Okay.
So, if you were really, you come in and you're just a savant at passing the guard, great, you're going to get a stripe. But you're not getting another stripe until you have the basics of taking the back. You're not going to have another stripe until you get the basics of, guard retention. So I like that general system with the kind of boxes that need to be checked, but what you check them with is up to you. But that's a very individualized system of teaching, right? If you're running a large school, you need to have S-mount attack S-mount attack to armbar from top. You need to have, 180 degrees spinning armbar from knee mount. Yes, no, check. I'm not sure there is a perfect system. I mean, there's so many people who've gotten good just rolling, right? There's some kinesthetic geniuses can just pick up most of what they need to know just by rolling. I hate those people. They exist.
Okay. You've got a new book out as well, so and program. So for people that have listened this far, they're going to know who you are and hopefully want to buy your products. So let's talk a little bit about the products that you've got in market. And the other thing that I wanted to ask you is, with downloading everything, is there a shelf life to products these days where you're sort of forced to say, everyone sort of has a series of instructionals that they continue to push out to make sure that they're relevant and current, and I assume have something to market?
Yeah. I don't think there's necessarily a shelf life. I mean, there's styles and trends in production quality and in amount of information shown. A lot of those techniques that I learned in the old Panther production videos, they're still good techniques. Now, some of the details have evolved for sure. Like a leg lock from 1995 is not the same as a leg lock from now. I'll grant you that. But the real problem with those videotapes back then is they would show a technique, then they'd show it from the other angle, then they'd show it from the other angle, then they'd show it from the other angle, then they'd show it in slow motion from angle 1, slow motion from angle 2. So it was the teaching method, it was the pedagogy that really sucked. So the technique itself was still good. It was just how it was taught. You know, how many details there were in, how quickly it's taught, how the instruction is organized. That sucked. The techniques, you know, still good. Like it worked then, it worked now, more or less. In terms of a shelf life, I don't know. I mean, the market in the last few years has really gotten very, very swamped on the digital side, and the book side of it has just completely died out. Right? Victory Belt books that used to produce half those books on this shelf here are Victory Belt martial arts books. There's a reason that they're mostly doing keto diet books now and haven't done a martial arts book in forever, because they don't make any money.
Well, it's hard to picture a move versus seeing it drawn out these days, especially when you can access it for free instantaneously.
Yeah. I think there are advantages to books. Number one, I like reading them. Number two, I like owning them. Number three, if I see a move in video, I don't know, say it's a YouTube video. Say it's a YouTube video of how to do a triangle choke from the half guard. And I watch it, now I understand it, and now I want to go drill it. It would take me another 8 minutes to watch that video again. Or if it's in 13 pictures in a book, I can review it much quicker. So I like the video paired with the book, because it's like more like a checklist, a visual checklist of like, here are the 8 steps you got to do. Oh, okay. So that's, I like the combination. I think there still is a use for books, but trying to convince people that books have a use is kind of a losing argument now. I mean, I don't ever want to move homes again. Just the number of bloody books I would need to move, and the number of bookshelves I'd need to move is sick. It makes me feel slightly sick to my stomach.
Well,
That all being said, I did just publish a book with Brandon Mullins. It's called Nonstop Jiu-Jitsu. I've been calling it the Bjj Book of the Year, which is easy to say because I don't think there have been any other technique books published this year. So, and it took 6 years to put that together, which is kind of, you know, I can shoot, if I'm working with somebody who knows what they're doing and they've got a game plan, you can shoot an instructional pretty quick. But that was a 6-year journey to get the editing in that book correct. And it's a work of art, I think, and it's a work of love, because you're not doing that to get rich. But anyhow, if it's doing really well on Amazon, check it out, Nonstop Jiu-Jitsu. It was supposed to be available in Australia, and then it turns out that Amazon in Australia doesn't do print on demand. So I apologize. I hope Amazon gets its stuff together down under soon.
What motivates you to do that? I think for people that know you already have an existing full-time job. So is this more of a business venture? Is it just a love and a hobby for you to continue to do this after all these years?
It's both. It's both. I mean, there's a saying, I'm a firefighter. So there's a saying that firefighters are either workaholics, alcoholics, or sportaholics. And I fit into the workaholic, sportaholic end of things. So if I'm going to be doing stuff, I might as well be doing stuff that I love, right? I actually really enjoy the process. There were times in that 6 years of writing that book or working on that book and doing the layout and trying to learn Adobe InDesign, which is a book layout program. It's completely different from any other program I've ever used, where I wanted to take my computer and smash it into small pieces. But now that it's out, I'm super proud of it, right? So it's kind of like a project that finally got off my shelf, and it feels off my plate, and it feels really good. I really enjoy running into people who found something like the Roadmap to BJJ ebook, which I put out, which is free, grapplearts.com/book, useful when they were starting jiu-jitsu, kind of like just a basic overview of the whole art and the basic positions and the basic transitions. And, you know, I get a couple emails a day from people saying, you know, that was super helpful, and it helped me make sense in my first jiu-jitsu class. And then if the money that I make doing that can fund other interesting projects, and sometimes they make money, sometimes they lose money, and on the whole, it's generally positive. I mean, man, that's if you're doing what you love, that's a good thing. It's a very, very good thing. Given how many people hate their jobs, I'm very, very lucky to love both of mine, which is Jitsu and firefighting. Like, it's a great combination.
Excellent. Well, I think that's a good place to leave it. I think we've been going for about 90 minutes or thereabouts. So, look, thanks very much for speaking with us. It's always cool to be able to speak to people remotely, and hopefully we get through this thing, and maybe we can chat again.
See, yeah, or even train in person. Wouldn't that be cool?
I get back home once every year and a half. I was there last time. I think it was December. What year are we in? 2018 is the last time I was back. So, but we were in van, so maybe.
Well, we'll see when this vaccine can't come soon enough.
Yeah.
So
awesome.
All right.
Thanks so
much,
much,
Jesse.
Cheers. This episode is brought to you by RomulusIT, offering fast, affordable remote support for common computer problems, including troubleshooting, health checks, virus removal, and software support. Visit RomulusIT.com to get your computer back on track.